When he stepped out of the flames, cradling a small, trembling dog in his arms, Mark felt like a hero. His face was smeared with soot, his clothes reeked of smoke, but his heart swelled with pride. He had risked his life to save another. And then the words that cut deeper than fire itself echoed in his ears. "Mark, you're no longer part of this team." His chief's voice struck him like a hammer. In that single moment, the cost of his bravery became clear. He had lost the only job, the only purpose that defined him. But the real twist wasn't in the flames. It was hanging from the dog's collar, a simple address tag. And when Mark followed it the next day, the door that opened revealed a face he never expected to see again, a face from his past. From that moment on, nothing in the city would ever be the same. Mark Sullivan wasn't the type of firefighter who sought glory. At 34, he had spent 12 years with Station 19 in Millfield, a mid-sized city where the biggest emergencies were usually kitchen fires or cats stuck in trees. He was methodical, reliable, and quietly respected by his crew. While other firefighters posed for photos with rescued families, Mark preferred to slip away, check his equipment, and prepare for the next call. His apartment reflected this same practical nature: clean, sparse, functional. A single photograph sat on his nightstand, his late father in full firefighting gear, taken just months before a warehouse collapse claimed his life when Mark was only 16. That photo was both his inspiration and his burden. Every call, every decision, every protocol he followed carried the weight of living up to a legacy he never felt worthy of. Mark had joined the department straight out of high school, following the path his father never got to finish. His mother had begged him to choose something safer: accounting, teaching, anything that wouldn't involve running into burning buildings. But Mark felt pulled by something deeper than career choice. It was duty, inherited and unshakable. His colleagues knew him as dependable but distant. He didn't join them for drinks after long shifts. He didn't share stories about his personal life because there wasn't much to share. Mark lived alone, dated occasionally, and poured most of his energy into being the best firefighter he could be. He studied building codes in his spare time, practiced rescue techniques until muscle memory took over, and never, ever broke protocol. Until today. Tuesday morning started like any other. The alarm rang at 7:43 a.m., jolting Mark from a dreamless sleep. Structure fire, 412 Elm Street, residential, multiple units responding. The address didn't register as significant, just another call in a neighborhood of aging Victorian homes converted into apartments. Station 19 arrived third on scene. Smoke was already billowing from the second-floor windows of a narrow 3-story building. Chief Reynolds immediately began coordinating with the other crews. Engine 7 on water supply, Ladder 12 setting up aerial operations, and Station 19 assigned to search and rescue on the first floor. Mark pulled on his breathing apparatus and followed Lieutenant Parker through the front door. The smoke was thick but manageable, visibility limited to just a few feet. They moved systematically, checking each room, calling out, listening for responses. The first floor appeared empty, furniture covered in sheets, windows boarded up. It looked like the building had been abandoned. That's when Mark heard it. A whimper, faint but unmistakable. "Parker," Mark called through his radio. "I've got something." The sound was coming from the back of the building, near what looked like a storage closet. Mark approached carefully, testing each floorboard. The whimpering grew louder, more desperate. He pushed open the closet door, and his headlamp illuminated a golden retriever, maybe 3 years old, cowering behind boxes of old Christmas decorations. The dog had a deep gash on its left hind leg, blood matting its golden fur. Its eyes were wide with terror, but it wasn't aggressive, just scared and hurt. "I found a dog," Mark radioed. "Injured. Back storage room, first floor." Chief Reynolds' voice crackled back immediately. "Copy that, Sullivan. Leave it. We don't have resources for animal rescue. Continue your sweep." Mark stared at the dog. Standard protocol was clear. Human life took priority. Always. They didn't have unlimited time or personnel to rescue pets. The dog would have to wait for animal control if the building didn't collapse first. But the dog whimpered again, trying to stand on 3 legs, and something in Mark broke. He thought of his father, who once told him, "A hero isn't someone who follows rules, son. A hero is someone who knows when the right thing matters more than the easy thing." Copy that, Chief, Mark replied. But instead of leaving, he knelt down beside the dog. Hey there, buddy, he whispered, extending his gloved hand. The dog sniffed cautiously, then pressed its head against his palm. Despite its fear, it seemed to understand that Mark was there to help. Mark scooped the dog into his arms, careful not to aggravate the leg wound. The animal was heavier than expected, probably 60 pounds, but Mark had carried much more in training. He could make it outside before anyone realized what he was doing. But as he emerged from the building with the golden retriever cradled against his chest, Chief Reynolds was waiting. "What the hell is that, Sullivan?" Chief Reynolds' voice cut through the chaos of the scene like a blade. Mark stood on the sidewalk, the injured golden retriever still in his arms, smoke billowing behind him. The dog's blood had soaked through Mark's jacket. Its breathing was shallow but steady. Around them, other firefighters paused their work, sensing the tension. "Injured animal, Chief," Mark said simply. "Found it trapped in." "I told you to leave it," Reynolds interrupted, his face red beneath his helmet. "We have protocols for a reason, Sullivan. What if there had been a person in that building while you were playing veterinarian?" Mark set the dog down gently on a patch of grass. A paramedic from Engine 7 was already approaching with a makeshift bandage. "The sweep was complete, sir. First floor was clear except for the dog. That's not the point." Reynolds stepped closer, his voice rising. "You disobeyed a direct order. You put yourself and potentially others at risk for an animal. What if the floor had collapsed? What if you'd needed backup and we were spread thin because you were off mission?" Around them, a small crowd had gathered. Residents from neighboring buildings, a few news crews that always seemed to appear at fires, and several city workers. Mark noticed a few people recording with their phones, but he kept his focus on his chief. "I understand your concern, sir," Mark said carefully. "But the dog was dying. 5 minutes wouldn't have made a difference to our operation, but it made all the difference to this animal." Chief Reynolds shook his head. "It's not your call to make, Sullivan. We have procedures. We have chains of command. We have insurance liabilities and public safety concerns you clearly don't understand." The golden retriever had managed to sit up, leaning against Mark's leg. Despite its injury, it looked up at him with unmistakable gratitude. Mark reached down to stroke its head, and that's when he noticed the collar. It wasn't a typical pet collar. It was leather, well-maintained, with a brass nameplate that read Buddy, and below it, an address, 1247 Oakwood Drive. But there was something else, a smaller tag that caught the light. It looked official, government-issued. "Sullivan," Reynolds said, his voice now deadly quiet. "You're off this scene. Report to the station. We'll discuss your future with the department after we finish here." Mark nodded. He'd expected this. 12 years of perfect service didn't erase one act of insubordination. He understood the rules, even if he didn't always agree with them. But as he walked toward his truck, the injured dog limping beside him, he noticed something that made him pause. A black sedan was parked across the street, engine running. The windows were tinted, but Mark could see the outline of someone watching the scene intently. The person in the car wasn't a curious neighbor or a news reporter. They were sitting too still, watching too carefully. And when Mark made eye contact with the windshield, the car immediately pulled away. Mark helped Buddy into his truck and drove toward the veterinary clinic on State Street. He'd figure out how to find the dog's owner later. Right now, the animal needed medical attention. He had no idea that the person in the black sedan was already making phone calls. And by morning, Mark's act of compassion would trigger a chain of events that would change not just his life, but the entire city of Millfield. Dr. Sarah Chen had seen plenty of injured animals in her 15 years as a veterinarian, but it was rare for a firefighter to walk through her doors carrying one. Mark sat quietly in the waiting room while she examined Buddy, his soot-stained uniform drawing curious looks from other pet owners. "The good news is it's not as bad as it looks," Dr. Chen said when she emerged from the examination room. "The cut is deep but clean, probably from broken glass. 16 stitches, antibiotics, and he should heal perfectly. You probably saved his life. Smoke inhalation can be just as dangerous for dogs as the physical injuries." Mark nodded. "Can you check his tags? I need to find his owner." Dr. Chen looked puzzled. There are no tags except the nameplate. No rabies vaccination tag, no city registration. That's unusual for a dog this well cared for. She paused, studying Mark's expression. Are you okay? You look like you've had a rough day. Just lost my job, Mark said simply. The story came out in pieces. Dr. Chen listened without judgment as Mark explained what had happened. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. You know, she said finally, I've been a vet for a long time. I've seen what happens to animals left behind in emergencies. Most don't make it. What you did today, that took real courage. Tell that to my chief. Maybe I will. Dr. Chen handed him a business card. Keep in touch about Buddy's recovery. And Mark, don't let anyone convince you that what you did was wrong. Mark drove home in silence, Buddy sleeping in the passenger seat. His phone had been buzzing with messages. News of his suspension was already spreading through the firefighter community. Most were supportive, but a few colleagues questioned his judgment. His apartment felt smaller than usual that evening. Mark sat on his couch, Buddy curled up at his feet, and stared at the address on the dog's collar. 1247 Oakwood Drive. He'd looked it up online. It was in Hillcrest, the affluent neighborhood on the north side of town. The property records showed it belonged to someone named Robert Martinez. The name didn't mean anything to Mark, but something about the situation felt off. The expensive collar, the lack of standard pet tags, the way the dog had been alone in what appeared to be an abandoned building, and that black sedan watching the fire scene. Mark's father had always told him to trust his instincts. Right now, those instincts were telling him there was more to this story. He decided to return Buddy tomorrow, in person. It was the right thing to do, and maybe it would give him some answers about why saving one dog had cost him everything. What Mark didn't know was that Robert Martinez had already heard about the fire, and he was furious, not at Mark, but at the people who had put Buddy in danger in the first place. Martinez had been searching for his missing dog for 3 days. Buddy had disappeared from his backyard, and despite hiring private investigators and offering a substantial reward, there had been no trace. Until tonight, when a phone call from someone who had been at the fire scene changed everything. As Mark slept fitfully on his couch, one arm draped protectively over the sleeping golden retriever, Martinez was making calls of his own. By morning, the quiet firefighter who had risked his career for an injured animal would discover that sometimes doing the right thing comes with unexpected consequences. And in Millfield, those consequences would reach all the way to City Hall. Mark woke to the sound of Buddy's tail thumping against the coffee table. The dog was sitting by the front door, looking much better after a night of rest. The bandage on his leg was clean and dry, and his eyes had regained their alertness. "Ready to go home, boy?" Mark asked, scratching behind Buddy's ears. The dog's response was a gentle woof and more tail wagging. The drive to Hillcrest took 20 minutes through morning traffic. Mark had called in sick to his shift, though technically he wasn't sure he still had shifts to call in sick from. Chief Reynolds had been clear about his suspension, but the formal disciplinary hearing wouldn't be for another week. 1247 Oakwood Drive was exactly what Mark expected from Hillcrest, a sprawling colonial mansion set back from the street by a circular driveway and meticulously maintained landscaping. The house was easily worth $2 million, with tall windows, white columns, and the kind of architectural details that spoke of old money. Mark parked his beat-up Toyota pickup next to a fountain in the center of the driveway, feeling suddenly self-conscious about his civilian clothes, jeans, a plain t-shirt, and work boots. Buddy, however, seemed to recognize where he was. His tail wagged furiously as he limped toward the front door. Before Mark could ring the doorbell, the door opened. Robert Martinez was not what Mark had expected. He was in his late 50s, average height, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a simple button-down shirt and khakis, nothing that screamed wealth or power. But when he saw Buddy, his composed demeanor cracked. "Oh my God," Martinez whispered, dropping to his knees as Buddy jumped into his arms. "Buddy, where have you been? I've been looking everywhere for you." The reunion was emotional. Martinez's eyes filled with tears as he ran his hands over his dog, checking for injuries, murmuring reassurances. Buddy pressed against his owner, tail wagging so hard his entire body wiggled. After a few moments, Martinez looked up at Mark. You found him? I pulled him out of a house fire yesterday, Mark said simply. He was trapped and injured. Had surgery last night to stitch up a cut on his leg. Martinez's expression changed. A house fire? Which house? 4 and 12 Elm Street. Old Victorian, looked like it had been abandoned. Something flickered across Martinez's face. Surprise, then anger, then something that looked like recognition. He stood up slowly, Buddy still pressed against his legs. I'm Robert Martinez, he said, extending his hand. And I owe you more than I can possibly express. Buddy here is, well, he's family. My wife passed away 2 years ago, and he's all I have left of her. Mark shook his hand. Mark Sullivan. I'm just glad he's okay. How did he get to Elm Street? Martinez asked, more to himself than to Mark. He disappeared from our backyard 3 days ago. I had people searching. I filed police reports. I even hired a private investigator. He paused, studying Mark's face. What did you say your last name was? Sullivan. Martinez's reaction was immediate and startling. His eyes widened, and he took a step back. Mark Sullivan? The firefighter who was suspended yesterday for rescuing Buddy. Mark tensed. How do you know about the suspension? Instead of answering, Martinez pulled out his phone and made a quick call. James, it's me. Cancel the meeting. Something more important has come up. He hung up and looked at Mark with an expression that was part curiosity, part admiration. Mr. Sullivan, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. Why did you risk your job to save my dog? Mark considered the question. Because it was the right thing to do. He was scared and hurt, and I couldn't just leave him there. Martinez nodded slowly. Even though you knew you'd face consequences? Yes. Even though he's just a dog, as some people would say? Mark felt a flash of anger. He's not just a dog. He's a living being who was in pain and needed help. If we only help when it's convenient or profitable, what kind of people does that make us? Martinez smiled for the first time since Mark had arrived. Mr. Sullivan, do you know what I do for a living? No, sir. I'm the mayor of Millfield, and yesterday one of my city employees was punished for showing exactly the kind of courage and compassion I wish I saw more of in public service. Mark felt the ground shift beneath him. You're the mayor? For the past 8 years, and Buddy here isn't just my pet, he's a trained therapy dog. My wife was battling cancer, and Buddy was specifically trained to help her through chemotherapy and recovery. When she passed, he became my support system, losing him these past 3 days. Martinez's voice trailed off. Mark's mind was racing. The mayor. The dog belonged to the mayor. Sir, I had no idea. Martinez held up a hand. That's exactly the point, Mr. Sullivan. And if you didn't do it for recognition or reward, you did it because it was right. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Before Mark could respond, another black sedan pulled into the driveway. This one Mark recognized. It was the car that had been watching the fire scene yesterday. The driver got out, a woman in a business suit with a badge clipped to her belt. Detective Morrison, Millfield Police, Martinez called out. Come meet the man who found Buddy. Detective Morrison approached with a professional smile. Mr. Sullivan, I've been hoping to speak with you. We've been investigating Buddy's disappearance, and based on what we found at the Elm Street property, we believe he was stolen. Stolen? Mark looked between Martinez and Morrison. Martinez's expression darkened. The house where you found Buddy, 412 Elm Street, it's scheduled for demolition next month to make way for a new shopping complex. The developer has been pressuring the city council to fast-track the permits, but I've been asking questions about their environmental impact studies and labor practices. Detective Morrison continued. We found evidence that someone broke into your backyard, Mr. Martinez, and took Buddy. We believe they were trying to use him as leverage, or worse, to send you a message. Mark felt sick. They left him in a burning building? The fire appears to have been accidental, Morrison said. Electrical issue in the old wiring. But whoever took Buddy had been keeping him in that building. When the fire started, they abandoned him. Martinez was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting on Buddy's head. When he spoke, his voice was cold with fury. Someone stole my dog to pressure me into approving their project. They left him to die rather than risk their own exposure. Mark suddenly understood the weight of what had happened. That's why you're telling me all this. Partly, Martinez said. but mostly because you need to understand something, Mr. Sullivan. What you did yesterday, risking your career to save a life, that's exactly the kind of person I want working for the city of Millfield. I don't understand. Martinez smiled. Mark, would you be interested in a job? The next morning, Mark woke up in his own apartment, but felt like he was living someone else's life. Less than 48 hours ago, he'd been a suspended firefighter facing a disciplinary hearing and possible termination. Now he was staring at a formal job offer from the city of Millfield. The position was Director of Emergency Services, a newly created role that would oversee coordination between police, fire, EMS, and animal control. The salary was nearly double what he'd been making as a firefighter, and the benefits included something he'd never had before: the authority to make decisions based on compassion rather than just protocol. Buddy was recovering well at Martinez's house, but the mayor had insisted that Mark visit daily to check on him. He's bonded with you, Martinez had explained. Therapy dogs don't usually take to strangers that quickly, but Buddy knows you saved his life. Mark's phone hadn't stopped ringing since news of his job offer leaked to the press. The story had everything journalists loved: corruption, animal abuse, a hero firefighter, and a mayor fighting back against dirty developers. National news outlets were calling it the Buddy effect. But the real story was happening behind the scenes. Detective Morrison's investigation had uncovered a web of corruption involving the Elm Street development project. The company behind it, Meridian Development, had been using increasingly aggressive tactics to push through projects across 3 states. Taking Buddy was just their latest escalation. They didn't expect the building to catch fire, Morrison had explained to Mark. Their plan was to keep Buddy for a few days, let Martinez worry, then find him in exchange for mayor's cooperation on the permits. When the fire started, they panicked and ran. The revelation sent shockwaves through Millfield's political establishment. 3 city council members who had been vocal supporters of the Meridian project suddenly requested additional environmental studies. 2 others called for full investigations into the company's other projects. Mark's first day as Director of Emergency Services was unlike anything he'd expected. Instead of fighting fires or responding to medical emergencies, he found himself in conference rooms with department heads, lawyers, and city planners. Your first priority, Martinez had told him, is to develop new protocols that prioritize life, all life, in emergency situations. I want animal rescue training for all first responders. I want coordination with veterinary services, and I want it clear that doing the right thing won't be punished in this city. It was exactly the kind of systemic change Mark had dreamed about, but never imagined he'd have the power to implement. His former colleagues at Station 19 had mixed reactions to his promotion. Lieutenant Parker was genuinely happy for him. You always thought bigger than the rest of us, he'd said. But Chief Reynolds was struggling with the situation. I don't disagree with what you did, Reynolds had admitted during a private conversation. But I had to follow departmental policy. I couldn't show favoritism just because I personally supported your decision. I understand, Mark had replied, but now I can help change those policies. The transformation wasn't just professional. Mark found himself becoming something he'd never been before, a public figure. The local newspaper wanted to do a feature story. Children at elementary schools sent him drawings of firefighters rescuing dogs. Animal rescue organizations were reaching out for partnerships. But the most meaningful change was personal. For the first time in years, Mark felt like he was living up to his father's legacy, not by following rules, but by having the courage to do what was right when it mattered most. 3 weeks after the fire, Mark stood in the backyard of Martinez's house, watching Buddy chase a tennis ball despite his slight limp. The dog's leg had healed perfectly, but the experience had changed him too. He was more alert, more protective, and utterly devoted to Mark whenever he visited. He knows, Martinez said, joining Mark on the patio. Dogs understand debt in a way humans often don't. I just did what anyone would do. Martinez shook his head. No, Mark, that's the point. Most people wouldn't have done what you did. Most people would have followed the rules, covered themselves legally, and justified it later. You chose to act with your heart. As if to prove the point, Buddy trotted over and dropped the tennis ball at Mark's feet, tail wagging expectantly. Mark picked up the ball and threw it across the yard, watching as Buddy raced after it with pure joy. "The developer's lawyers contacted me yesterday," Martinez said quietly. "Meridian Development is withdrawing their permit applications for all projects in Millfield. Apparently, our investigation triggered inquiries in other cities where they're operating." Mark felt a surge of satisfaction. Good. There's something else. The City Council voted unanimously last night to establish the Buddy Martinez Emergency Animal Response Fund. Every first responder in Millfield will receive specialized training in animal rescue. We're also partnering with the Veterinary College to have emergency veterinary support available 24/7. Mark stared at Martinez. "They named it after Buddy?" "Actually, they wanted to name it after you. I convinced them that Buddy was the real hero here. He brought all of us together." As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the perfectly manicured yard, Mark realized that sometimes the most important moments in life come disguised as ordinary decisions. His choice to save an injured dog had revealed corruption, changed city policy, advanced his career, and given him a sense of purpose he'd been searching for his entire adult life. But more than that, it had reminded him of something his father had tried to teach him years ago. True heroism isn't about following rules or seeking recognition. It's about having the courage to act on your values when it costs you something. Buddy bounded back with the tennis ball, but instead of dropping it at Mark's feet, he sat and offered it directly to Mark's hand. It was a gesture of trust, respect, and gratitude that needed no translation. Mark accepted the ball and scratched behind Buddy's ears. "Good boy," he whispered. And in that moment, surrounded by the evidence of how one small act of courage can ripple outward to change an entire community, Mark finally understood what his father had meant about being worthy of the legacy. 6 months later, Mark Sullivan stood before the Millfield City Council, delivering his quarterly report on emergency services. The numbers were impressive. Response times were down, coordination between departments was seamless, and they'd successfully rescued 43 animals from emergency situations without compromising human safety. But the statistics didn't capture the real change. Millfield had become a model for other cities. The Millfield Protocol for Emergency Animal Rescue was being adopted across the state. Mark had been invited to speak at conferences, training academies, and universities. More importantly, the culture of the emergency services had shifted. Firefighters, paramedics, and police officers now saw animal rescue as part of their core mission, not a distraction from it. The city had partnered with local veterinarians to provide free emergency care for animals rescued from dangerous situations. Mayor Martinez, who had been re-elected by the largest margin in city history, often told people that finding Buddy had led him to find the kind of public servant he'd always hoped to work with. The corruption investigation had cleaned house in city government, and Millfield's approval ratings for municipal services had reached all-time highs. Buddy himself had become something of a celebrity. He accompanied Mark to schools and community events, serving as both therapy dog and symbol of the change that was possible when people chose compassion over convenience. But perhaps the most satisfying change was personal. Mark had met Dr. Sarah Chen for coffee a few weeks after starting his new job. Coffee had turned into dinner. Dinner had turned into weekend hikes with Buddy, and now they were planning a future together that neither had expected. "You know what I love most about your story?" she'd told him recently as they watched Buddy play in the dog park. "It's not that you saved one dog. It's that saving one dog saved everything else." Mark understood what she meant. His decision in that burning building had been about Buddy, but it had revealed something much larger. A community ready to choose compassion over corruption, courage over convenience, and doing what's right over what's easy. As he finished his report to the city council, Mark caught sight of a familiar face in the audience. Chief Reynolds, now retired, gave him a subtle nod of approval. They'd never spoken about that day at the fire, but the gesture said everything that needed to be said. After the meeting, Mark walked out to the parking lot where Buddy was waiting in his truck, head hanging out the window, tail wagging at the sight of his favorite human. The dog's leg had healed completely, but he still wore a small scar, a reminder of the day that changed both their lives. Mark scratched behind Buddy's ears and looked back at City Hall, where the lights were still on in Mayor Martinez's office. Tomorrow, there would be new emergencies, new challenges, new opportunities to choose between what's easy and what's right. But tonight, Mark Sullivan, former rule-following firefighter, current director of emergency services, and forever the man who chose to save an injured dog, was going home to plan a future built on the simple principle that every life has value. And in Millfield, that principle was no longer just an ideal. It was policy. Sometimes the smallest acts of courage create the biggest changes. In a world that often chooses convenience over compassion, Mark Sullivan's story reminds us that true heroism isn't about following rules. It's about knowing when doing the right thing matters more than protecting yourself. This story is part of True Heroic Stories, where we celebrate the quiet courage of ordinary people who choose to act when it matters most. Because sometimes, saving one life can change everything else.